So today's topic is the idea of variable. Now when you listen to the word variable, of course vary, change, kind of comes into play. And while that's true in many cases, it's really useful in mathematics to have sort of a dual understanding of the word variable. Because sometimes in the context that we're working in, and by the way, that's a really important point, you have to take all of that I'm about to say within the context that we're thinking about at a moment. But within a context, this word variable could have a couple of different meanings. It could be a placeholder for a particular quantity, or it could be a ever-changing quantity depending on the context. And so I have a couple of examples here, same general context, but just to kind of get at the nuance between placeholder and changing quantity, the context is kind of similar. So you'll notice here that in this case, the context is, think about a trip to Flagstaff, Arizona. I get in my car, I set my odometer to 0, my trip odometer to 0, and I drive to Flagstaff. And upon arriving at Flagstaff, my odometer is going to read something. And let's say I arrive at my destination, I stop the car, I turn it off. At that moment, my odometer is going to read something. And that something is not a changing quantity. It's going to be whatever it's going to be at that moment. Now, it's an unknown quantity right now because I haven't actually done that trip today. But let's say in this context, I'm about to leave, and in my mind at this moment, this variable is going to have some value, some quantity upon arrival. It's not changing, it's going to be something set as soon as I stop the car and park it. Now on the other hand, imagine this context. Think about a variable, again, my odometer reading or my trip odometer reading on my car. But this time, rather than waiting until I get there and thinking about whatever that odometer reading is going to be, think about that odometer reading while I'm driving to Flagstaff. So at any moment between Chandler and Flagstaff, my trip odometer is going to have some number on it. And that number is going to be always changing. In both cases, we have a variable quantity. Variable as placeholder, it's just holding the place of that unknown reading on my odometer once I reach Flagstaff. Or it's going to have an ever-changing quantity as I imagine looking at that odometer, trip odometer, at any moment as I drive to Flagstaff. And so it's going to be important for us to recognize that a variable in mathematics can have either meaning depending on the context. So we have to remember, keep it confined to the context that we're in, and then have a conscious understanding of how we're thinking about variable in that moment. Now in mathematics, because we use variables as a way to communicate, as a way to mathematize a real situation, we like to define our variables. And so we're going to get into this convention of defining variables that looks like this. First of all, we're going to use a letter, a reasonable letter for the situation, for the context that we're in. So suppose in this context we're talking about a odometer reading. So in my mind, an odometer reading is measuring a distance, how far I've traveled on this trip. So I'm going to use D for distance, and then we use equals just to tell people, to communicate to people how we're defining this variable. And so I'm going to say that D is the distance traveled. But now we always, in terms of precision here, like to say, well, how are we going to measure that distance? Distances in general can be measured in feet, in inches, in meters, in kilometers. But in the context of my car, and my odometer, or my trip odometer, that unit of measure is probably going to be in miles. So as you define your variables, choose a reasonable letter that's going to communicate to somebody what that letter really stands for, D for distance, for example. Write out just a brief summary, not the full, you don't need the full explanation, but just distance traveled. So in the context that I'm working with, it would be clear that D is a distance traveled to Flagstaff, and then a unit of measure that defines that. So that's the focus of the idea of variable that is going to set a foundation that's going to help us through the algebraic structure situation that we find ourselves in here in this module.